It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Laura Carstensen. Laura is the Professor of Psychology and the Fairleigh Dickinson Professor in Public Policy at Stanford University. She's got all the academic plaudits and groundbreaking research that support such a prestigious title, including having served on the National Advisory Council on Aging and being inducted into the National Academy of Medicine. And I warmly encourage you to read her book, A Long, Bright Future, Happiness, Health, and Financial Security in an Age of Increased Longevity. You can see why we wanted her here. At Stanford, she's established the Center on Longevity, which does what is so sorely needed in this area, bringing together an impressive range of faculty across Stanford and across a range of disciplines to study the issue of longevity. She's currently embarking on what I think is a fantastic project, and it's why I'm so glad she can make the very long journey to be here today and talk about her new project, A New Map of Life. Laura, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for the lovely introduction. Congratulations to you and to Jim for this wonderful event and launching this initiative. I wish you great success because we need you to be successful in this new longevity because you will make the world a better place. And I'm delighted to be here with you all this morning. My plan is to provide a really broad bird's eye view of longevity in the 21st century. I want to say a little bit about how we got here, the challenges we now face, and say a few words about what I think we need to do now in order to prepare for the future. But let me just cut to the chase. We are living a lot longer than our ancestors ever would have dreamed. As Andrew pointed out, life expectancy has increased dramatically. And I can make some assumptions about your backgrounds, your levels of education and affluence in society, and adding that to the mix, I can tell you that the vast majority of you in this room are going to sail through your 80s into your 90s, and many of you will live to be 100 and beyond. And your children, your grandchildren, well, there are some distinguished biodemographers who maintain that the majority of babies born in the Western world since the year 2000 will live to be 100 and beyond. Now, there are differences in opinion. Some people think that life expectancy will increase even more, that children born today will be living to be 120. But frankly, whether it's 100 or 120, or as Andrew suggested, even if it remained what it is today, these have profound implications for every aspect of life as we know it. I know you know that people are living longer. This information is, sort of seeped into the educated public, and we're very familiar with these numbers. We know that it's gone up. Sometimes I worry that we talk about it and hear about it so much that the profundity of this change can somehow go unnoticed. But this is absolutely profound, this change and the speed at which it occurred. So throughout most of human evolution, life was short. I mean, really short. So as our ancestors were evolving on the African savanna, life expectancy was somewhere between 18 and 20. We don't know for sure. But just to give you an idea, it was short. And in these early years, evolution acted on life expectancy. It acted in the way that evolution acts, and life got a little bit longer, a little bit longer, a little bit longer. And then fast forward to the mid-1800s, life expectancy in Great Britain and in the United States had reached the mid-30s. Go to 1900, life expectancy in the US was 47. And then at the end of that same century, life expectancy was 77, and today it's 79, and we're continuing to see increases. Now, across those very same years, that life expectancy was going up so dramatically. Think about this. It went up about 25 years over 5,000 years. And then in less than 100 years, we added 30 years to life expectancy. That's fast. And across this century, the 20th century, fertility rates fell by half. So the average American woman in 1900 had 4.2 children, dropped to 2.1 by the end of that century. So we have half as many children born, and we live 30 years longer, and those two phenomena together create aging societies. We could have had just a very large population, but not aging societies. We would have had a major population explosion. But those two factors together reshaped the distribution of age in a way that, again, is changing our world irrevocably. In very few years, we will have more people over 60 than under 5. We will have more old people than children in the global population. Again, striking and unprecedented. As recently as 1950, every country in the world had a pyramid-shaped population. By that I mean many young ones at the bottom. You see males on one side, females on the other here. Many at the bottom went out to this tiny peak at the top of those who survive and make it all the way to old age. And the phenomenon that we're living through is that that pyramid is being reshaped into a rectangle. And I tell people that, if you're the type of person who can get chills from biostatistics, my people, then these are the ones that should do it, because it means that for the first time in human history, the vast majorities of babies born in the developed world are having the chance to grow old. How did we get here? Well, this is a story that does not begin with a story about old people at all. This begins with a story about babies. In 1900 in the US, 25% of babies born died before they reached 5. Many more died before they reached 12, and death was common at all ages. In fact, death was so common at any age that it wasn't strongly associated in people's minds with old age. It was associated with young life. And our ancestors, concerned about the welfare of the youngest in society, began to invest heavily in science and technology and behavioral changes to protect young life. It was an incredible series of changes that occurred that improved life. It was, in a word, a change in culture. And by culture, I'm not talking about only the foods that people like to eat or the languages they speak, but culture meaning the crucible that holds science and technology, medicine, the built environment, behavioral norms, and social practices. Culture changed, and it is culture that brought about this increase in life expectancy. We discovered the causes of diseases and how they were spread. And then we developed widespread public health programs that could inoculate little ones against diseases they would never have to suffer. We didn't stop there. We identified that nutritional disorders were actually undergirding many of the problems that young children were having, including pellagra and gout and rickets. And in Europe and the United States, in a matter of 2 decades, built nutritional supplements into the food supply that virtually eliminated these disorders. We didn't stop there. We purified the waterways. We pasteurized milk. We implemented the systematic disposal of waste, garbage collection. And there are historians of this era who say you have your garbage collectors to thank as much as your physicians for this increase in life expectancy. Agricultural technologies were developed that, for the first time in history, provided a steady food supply throughout the year. Dramatically changing fitness and health. Robert Fogel, Nobel laureate at the University of Chicago, has referred to these changes as technophysio evolution. Evolution not by natural selection by any means, but rather brought about because of these scientific and technological advances. But I think in some ways that's too narrow a term, because we also changed the way we lived. As fertility rates fell, we came to invest more in children. We passed child labor laws that kept them out of factories and mines. We put in place public education so that all children, not just the privileged few, could learn how to read and write. And today, at some point in adulthood, education is a better predictor of life expectancy than age. That is a stunning observation. So the population pyramid has been reshaped, and here we are, standing at a point in history where, for the first time, 4 and 5 generations will routinely be alive at the same time. Let me put it this way. A 20-year-old male today has a better chance of having a living grandmother than a 20-year-old in 1900 had of having a living mother. Now, this is an extraordinary cultural achievement, and you might think that we'd be dancing in the streets, celebrating, yay, we're living a long time, we're growing very old. It's more time, it's more years. This is an incredible gift, no strings attached. More time to spend with our loved ones, to realize our goals, to chase our dreams. But that has not been the typical response to aging and aging societies. Instead, we're worried. Individuals are worried about their parents and their future selves. Policymakers, public leaders are concerned about programs and plans and societal structures that were put in place premised on a pyramid-shaped age distribution, where suddenly that age distribution no longer represents us. There were concerns early on when we realized just how big this change was, that we'd created a nightmare scenario, that what we had done inadvertently, our ancestors did by protecting the young ones, was to lead to a population full of people who were frail and infirm but didn't die. There were concerns, and continue to be concerns, that cognitive decline will reduce productivity in the workforce and economic growth. There are concerns that society will be increasingly populated by depressed and isolated elderly people. Now, I would like to tell you that there is no reason for concern, that everything's going to be just fine. But I can't. I don't have a lot of time with you today, and so what I thought I would do is to make one slide that represents the research on aging and just summarize it for you here. And you can put any variable you like here on the y-axis, and age. There's a lot of evidence for this in a lot of different domains. We've got real challenges ahead. But at the same time, the more we learn about aging, the clearer it becomes that aging itself is malleable. So let me tell you about some findings in recent years that suggest that aging itself is a moving target, and that we can, in fact, influence how it unfolds. Older people today are not the same as older people were 30 years ago. And we have good reason to think that it can change much more, and you'll hear more about that today. But let me give you just a smattering of findings. Here's findings from a recent survey in the US where we have among the shortest life expectancies in the developed world. But this was a survey where they asked people about functional health, not how many diseases do you have. And clearly, when you have aging populations, you're going to see more chronic disease represented in that population. But the question here that was asked was about functional health. Are you healthy enough to work? And what they find here is two things. One is you can see the percentage of people who say they're healthy enough to work goes down with age. But what I really want you to focus on here, more than 50% of respondents 85 and older said, yeah, I'm healthy enough to work. Functional health is changing, probably faster and more so than other kinds of measures of physical health. Here's another way to think about functional health as a function of people's ability to navigate the world, and we can index that by education level. So this is functional health measured by your answers to 4 questions, and they're things like, can you live on your own, can you drive a car, can you go up 4 or 5 flights of stairs without any problem? And we asked this question, the researchers asked this question, Jim House and his colleagues, and they broke down functional health, functional limitations by level of education. So what you see in the red are people with college education, 4 years plus or more, right? In blue, you've seen people in the middle, it's like a year or 2 of college, could be an associate's degree. And then green, you see people who dropped out of high school, so don't have a high school education. Now, there are a couple things to observe here. One is when people are very young, they tend to be fit, regardless of education level. And when people are very old, this is well over average life expectancy, they tend to get sick before they die. So far, death, 100%. So we see these converging, but look at the middle of life. We see dramatic differences in the functional health of people as predicted by their education level. Now, this is great news for you in this room. It is not great news for society because most people aren't in that category of having more college. But what this says is that aging is malleable, profoundly so. And what this says in scientific terms is that variability speaks against inevitability. If people are declining on average, but people with high levels of education aren't showing that decline with age, it's not age. It's about something else. It's about something else that's correlated with age. We hear about cognitive decline and aging, and it is true that there is considerable evidence for some cognitive decline in fluid processing skills, the uptake of new information. Knowledge continues to go up anyway with age. But what we've also seen is a steady decline in the incidence of dementia. And we've been seeing this now since the 1970s. We're not sure what it is, but many people think it has to do with education. There was a recent report, this New York Times article is based on that, that found that between 2000 and 2012, the incidence of dementia fell by 24%. Now that's incidence in a particular cohort. With aging societies, we have more old people. You'll still see numbers go up, but the likelihood of becoming demented is going down. And I mentioned the concern about all of those, sad, isolated, lonely, kind of pathetic old people. Well, I call this the misery myth. It is a myth. It turns out that older people not only are not depressed and lonely, they're doing better than any other age group in adulthood. Older people have less negative emotion in day-to-day life, report less stress. They also report things like a greater likelihood to forgive, more appreciation, more gratitude for life, and a motivation to give back. Now, emotion regulation, these changes in emotional stability coupled with knowledge, means that we have a population of people who are not just happy, but who are able to change the world, to change society in an important way. Older people represent a growing resource that we quite literally cannot afford to overlook. As my friend and colleague Mark Friedman likes to say, older people are the only natural resource on the planet that's actually growing. I want you to begin to consider, as you will today in groups, what this may mean for the population in the future. Now, when people are healthy and when they're knowledgeable, they tend to stay engaged more. They stay engaged in communities and also in workforces and volunteer activities. We hear a lot today about aging workforces. I think the more profound change in the workforce is the age diversification of the workforce, and employers who find ways to create structures within their workplaces that capitalize on the contributions that are different that older and younger workers are making stand to gain in productivity, and there's growing evidence for that. We have a lot more work to do, but as Andrew mentioned, and as you will be hearing more about today, one of the most exciting things about longevity is that we are living longer at a time in history when the potentials of science and technology are breathtaking. Scientists you'll hear from today are not only tackling the kinds of diseases that come about with age, but rather slowing that basic biology of aging that puts us today at risk for virtually all diseases the older that we get. People today, scientists, are beginning to understand that basic metabolism, how nutrition may interact with metabolic syndromes, how there may be other ways to slow this fundamental process associated with inflammation, gene expression, and so on and so forth, that could again dramatically alter and improve health span. So an essential question that we're left with is, what are we going to do with these added years of life? You know, so far, we inherited 30 extra years of life and we tacked them all on at the end, and only old age got longer. It's time to rethink the way we live. And we're beginning to do that in a new project that we've started, that we've launched with Andrew's input and Julia Randall-Kahn's magnificent help, to put together a new project that we're calling the New Map of Life. And this project is premised on the idea that you cannot achieve what you cannot envision. And there are a lot of us in this longevity space who are working on one aspect of longevity. And we began to think that you've really got to work on all of them at the same time. You know, if we have a substantial number of children in our worlds who are obese, and obesity predicts diabetes, and diabetes predicts dementia, we need to start working on that early. If we're going to say people need to work longer, and they do, then we need to make sure that people are healthy enough to work longer. We need to make sure that employers are willing and ready to accept and embrace and support older workers. A lot has to change. But when we hear these negative, frightening kinds of predictions about the future, they're all premised on the idea that nothing changes. They're premised on the idea that disease increases linearly as we age. They're premised on the idea that we finish our education in our mid-20s and that we retire in our early 60s. We need to change the way we live. So imagine if we were to do what our ancestors did 100 years ago and began to invest with the same level of energy and ingenuity in solving the problems of people 50 and older, so that they, as our ancestors did, in trying to improve the welfare of children. Again, keep in mind, when people say, oh, but that's aging, that's so hard, that 25% of babies born died before they were 5 100 years ago. We can take this on. We can take it on because we have the capacity in science and technology, and we can take it on if we're willing to change the way we live. So we've begun this project called the New Map of Life, where we're beginning to think through how we need to change multiple domains of life, how we need to think about early childhood influences on long-term outcomes, how do we keep people financially secure throughout 100 years. We're beginning to develop now deep analyses of these different domains that we will, after a couple years, integrate into a single new map of life that's intended to be a relatively generic template of what a society needs to do in order to keep people happy, healthy, and secure for 100 years or more. I'm going to leave you with this. The next time you drive by a schoolyard or a nursery school, a playground, and you look out and you see those little ones, they're climbing on the play structures and they're swinging on the tire swings, I want you to remember that you're seeing the first centenarians of the 22nd century. They're here, they're living among us, and it is our job, indeed, I think it is our duty, to create a world that will support them all the way through. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So remember to send through your questions on Slido. That's how I'm going to try and do it. I've got one question queued up already, Laura. Just a quick comment, perhaps. By the way, I loved your idea of age being malleable. That's obviously going to be the uniting theme throughout the day, both in terms of the human biology and the human behavior. One question, the mortality rates that you showed us earlier on, did they strip out child mortality? Just how much of this life expectancy is coming after those first 5 years of life?
Oh, after the first 5.
Yeah.
It looks like it's about half and half. So the half of those 30 years of increased life expectancy in the 20th century came from reducing childhood mortality. And people at the time thought that'd probably be it. But then medical advances in the second half of the 20th century, much of which were related to the treatment of heart disease and specifically second heart attacks, came to increase life expectancy in adulthood. And again, that's something that we're continuing to see go up.
Yeah. And you can see that from the rectangular nature of your pyramids as well. I say, any more questions on Slido? We've got perhaps time for one question from the floor, if someone wants to put their hand up. It's the trouble having a mixed audience where people don't know one another. Right at the back, the gentleman there, right at the back.
Thank you for a brilliant talk. Well, you are the creator of the socio-emotional selectivity theory, and which essentially postulates that the longer you expect to live, the younger you're going to behave. At least that's my conclusion there. So what would be your advice to the audience today? How long should we expect to live?
Eric, could you tell people the answer? Honestly, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think anybody knows the answer to that. Albert, you may know the answer to that. It's going to depend on many, many different factors. Myself, you want to know a psychological finding here, is that once you get past about 20 years, humans are really bad at being able to even imagine it. So if I said to you, I want you to imagine tonight, you're going to be really hungry, and you're not going to be able to get the kind of food you wanted, you'd care. If I said to you, in 20 years, you're going to be hungry, and you might not be able to get the food you want, you care less. Because we somehow think that we treat our future selves like strangers. And I think that's part of the reason people don't prepare well. We don't connect our future fitness and health and financial security or even social relationships as something that's going to... So I don't think in some ways it matters whether it's going to be 100 or 120. We need to start thinking about the long term, and we need to start anticipating and investing in our futures. You know, life for most of human history has been a sprint. You know, you just, and the way we live our lives and the way we used to made a lot of sense. You know, when you're going to live to be 50, let's say, you better get an education, learn something, some skills, acquire, find a mate, have a couple kids, ensure survival of the species, work like a dog, retire, die. You know, that's what you got time for doing. Now we've got marathon lives. And in order to do them well, we can't run the sprint. We need to take better care of ourselves all the way through and anticipate long futures. And thank you for reading about socio-emotional selectivity theory. And thank you all.
Great, thank you very much, Laura.